The explosion tore through the winter night like the wrath of God himself. At 2 in the morning on February 10, 1567, the quiet suburb of Kirk O'Field just outside Edinburgh's city walls erupted in a thunderous blast that shattered windows half a mile away. Flames licked hungrily at the Scottish sky as debris rained down on the frozen ground, and the acrid smell of gunpowder hung heavy in the frigid air. But this was no accident. This was regicide, the murder of a king. In the smoldering ruins of what had once been a modest two-story house, neighbors and night watchmen scrambled through the wreckage, expecting to find the charred remains of Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, King Consort of Scotland. The 21-year-old had been recovering from what many believed to be syphilis in this very house, placed there by his wife, Mary Queen of Scots, ostensibly for his health and safety. Yet as dawn broke over the devastation, searchers made a discovery that would send shockwaves through the royal courts of Europe and ignite a mystery that endures to this day. 60 yards from the explosion, in a small orchard behind the house, lay two bodies in nothing but their nightshirts. One was Lord Darnley himself, tall, golden-haired, and strikingly handsome even in death. Beside him lay his young valet, William Taylor. Neither body bore a single burn mark. Neither showed signs of blast trauma. Instead, both men appeared to have been strangled, their necks bearing the telltale marks of rope or cord. Near their bodies lay a chair, a length of rope, a dagger, and a coat, as if someone had staged the scene with theatrical precision. How had the King of Scotland and his servant escaped a massive explosion that leveled their lodging, only to die of strangulation in a garden 60 yards away? Who had access to enough gunpowder to obliterate an entire house? And most chilling of all, who would dare murder the husband of Mary Queen of Scots, one of the most powerful monarchs in 16th century Europe? The answers would unravel a web of political conspiracy, sexual intrigue, and betrayal that reached to the very heart of the Scottish throne. They would expose the dark ambitions of Scotland's most powerful nobles, reveal the dangerous game of love and power played by a beautiful queen, and ultimately trigger the downfall of a dynasty that had ruled Scotland for over 2 centuries. If cases like this fascinate you, subscribe to the Crime O'Clock, where every mystery has a ticking timeline waiting to be uncovered. As news of Lord Darnley's death spread through Edinburgh's narrow streets that February morning, one thing became immediately clear. This was no crime of passion committed in a moment of rage. The meticulous planning, the sophisticated use of explosives, and the careful staging of the murder scene all pointed to something far more sinister. A coordinated assassination plot involving multiple conspirators with access to both royal quarters and military resources. But who among Scotland's nobility would risk everything to kill their king? And why had Mary Queen of Scots, the grieving widow, moved her husband to this isolated house just days before his death? A house that local records show she had specifically requested be prepared for his convalescence. The investigation that followed would expose secrets that powerful people had killed to keep buried, secrets that threatened not just individual lives but the stability of nations. For in 1567, Scotland stood at a crossroads of history, caught between the rising power of Protestant England and the Catholic might of France and Spain. The murder of Lord Darnley would tip that balance in ways no one could have predicted. As Edinburgh's magistrates began their investigation, they could not have known they were about to uncover one of history's most sophisticated royal conspiracies, a plot that had been months in the making and involved some of the most powerful figures in the Scottish court. The trail of evidence would lead from the smoky taverns where hired killers planned their work to the silk-draped chambers where queens and earls conducted their secret negotiations. The Game of Thrones had turned deadly, and Lord Darnley, for all his royal blood and political ambition, had become its first casualty. To understand the brutal murder that shook Scotland in 1567, we must journey back to July 29, 1565, a summer day that began with wedding bells and would end in tragedy. On this date, in the Chapel Royal at Holyrood Palace, two of Europe's most beautiful young nobles spoke vows that would forever alter the course of British history. Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots, was 22 years old and widely regarded as the most eligible monarch in Europe. Standing nearly 6 feet tall with auburn hair that caught the light like spun copper, She possessed an otherworldly beauty that had captivated courts from Edinburgh to Paris. Fluent in 6 languages, accomplished in music and poetry, and raised in the sophisticated French court, Mary was everything a Renaissance queen should be: intelligent, cultured, and devastatingly charismatic. Her groom, Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, was 19 and possessed the kind of masculine beauty that belonged in Renaissance paintings. With his golden hair, piercing blue eyes, and athletic frame honed by hours of swordplay and hunting, Darnley was said to be the most handsome man in Scotland. More importantly, he carried royal blood from both English and Scottish lines, making him not just Mary's husband, but her closest heir and the father of future kings. Yet beneath the fairy tale veneer of this royal wedding lay a web of political calculation and dangerous ambition. Mary had chosen Darnley not just for love, but as a strategic move in the deadly game of 16th-century politics. Their marriage united 2 branches of the Stuart line and strengthened Mary's claim to the English throne, a claim that made her Catholic cousin Elizabeth Tudor deeply uneasy. The match had been arranged in secret, conducted with breathtaking speed that shocked European courts. When Mary first met Darnley in February 1565, he was merely the second son of the Earl of Lennox, living in political exile. By July, he was King Consort of Scotland. The whirlwind romance seemed to prove that even queens could be swept away by passion. But passion, as Mary would learn, was a dangerous foundation for a throne. From their wedding night, cracks began to appear in the perfect royal facade. Darnley had expected to receive the crown matrimonial, the right to rule Scotland as an equal partner and to retain the throne should Mary die before bearing an heir. This was no mere ceremonial title. It represented real political power, the authority to make decisions of war and peace, life and death. Mary, however, had granted him only the courtesy title of King Henry. He could wear a crown and sit beside her in ceremonies, but the actual power remained hers alone. For a young man raised to believe that masculine authority was divinely ordained, this arrangement was both humiliating and infuriating. The Scottish nobility, meanwhile, watched this royal drama with growing alarm. Many had opposed the marriage from the beginning, fearing that Darnley's English connections would make Scotland a puppet of foreign interests. Others resented his rapid elevation from minor lord to king, seeing it as an affront to ancient bloodlines and established hierarchies. Darnley's response to these challenges revealed the fatal flaw in his character. Beneath his golden exterior lay a core of petulant rage and uncontrolled ambition. When denied the crown matrimonial, he began to drink heavily and publicly berate his wife. When Scottish lords refused to show him the deference he believed he deserved, he plotted against them with increasing recklessness. By the winter of 1565, barely 6 months after their wedding, Mary was pregnant and growing increasingly isolated from her husband. Darnley spent his days hunting and his nights drinking, surrounding himself with disreputable companions who fed his grievances and encouraged his worst impulses. The romantic passion that had driven their hasty marriage was curdling into mutual resentment and barely concealed contempt. Yet the young royal couple maintained the appearance of unity, appearing together at state ceremonies and official portraits. Mary needed Darnley's bloodline to legitimize her rule and strengthen her dynastic claims. Darnley needed Mary's actual power to fulfill his royal ambitions. They were trapped in a marriage that served political necessity but satisfied neither partner's deepest needs. As 1566 dawned, the Scottish court buzzed with whispers about the royal marriage. Some courtiers spoke of Mary's growing fondness for her Italian secretary, David Rizzio, a cultured musician who shared her love of poetry and philosophy. Others noted Darnley's increasingly erratic behavior and his public complaints about being denied his rightful authority. None could have predicted that these simmering tensions would soon explode into violence that would shock Europe and set in motion the events leading to that February night in 1567. The beautiful queen and her golden husband had become prisoners of their own ambitions, trapped in a marriage that would destroy them both. The first drops of blood fell on March 9, 1566, exactly 8 months after Mary and Darnley's fairy tale wedding. But this blood would not be spilled in some distant battlefield or noble duel. It would pool on the floor of Holyrood Palace itself, staining the very heart of Scottish power with a brutality that shocked even the violence-hardened nobles of the 16th century. By the spring of 1566, Darnley's frustration with his powerless position had transformed into something far more dangerous: active conspiracy against his own wife's government. Denied the crown matrimonial he believed was his birthright, the young king had begun to court Scotland's Protestant lords with promises of religious reform and political favor. His message was seductive in its simplicity: remove the Catholic Queen's advisors and place real power in the hands of a Protestant king. At the center of Darnley's growing paranoia was David Rizzio, Mary's Italian private secretary. The short, hunchbacked musician had risen from obscurity to become one of Mary's most trusted confidants, handling her private correspondence and advising her on matters of state. Rizzio spoke fluent French, shared Mary's love of poetry and music, and possessed the kind of sophisticated cultural knowledge that the rough Scottish nobility lacked. To Darnley, Rizzio represented everything humiliating about his position. Here was a foreign commoner who enjoyed more of his wife's trust and attention than he did. Worse, malicious courtiers had begun whispering that Mary's pregnancy, now visible beneath her elaborate gowns, might not be Darnley's child at all. The rumors were almost certainly false, but they struck at the core of Darnley's masculine pride and royal legitimacy. The conspiracy that would destroy Rizzio began in the smoky chambers of Edinburgh's Protestant lords, men who had watched Mary's Catholic advisors with growing alarm. Patrick Ruthven, George Douglas, and Andrew Kirk, all hardened veterans of Scotland's religious wars, found in the bitter young king a perfect instrument for their ambitions. They would use Darnley's jealousy to eliminate their political enemies, while simultaneously humiliating the queen they had never truly accepted. The plot they hatched was breathtaking in its audacity and cruelty. They would force their way into the queen's private chambers during a small dinner party, drag Rizzio away from her presence, and murder him before her eyes. The message would be unmistakable: no one, not even the queen herself, was beyond their reach. On the evening of March 9th, Mary was dining intimately with Rizzio and her half-sister Jean, Countess of Argyll, in her private supper chamber at Holyrood. The room was small and warm, lit by flickering candles that cast dancing shadows on the tapestried walls. Mary, now 6 months pregnant, was relaxed and laughing at Rizzio's witty observations about court gossip. At approximately 7 o'clock, Darnley entered the chamber through a private staircase that connected to his own apartments. His appearance was not unusual. He often joined Mary for private dinners, but tonight there was something different in his manner. His face was flushed, his movements jerky with nervous energy. Within moments, the chamber filled with armed men. Patrick Ruthven, gaunt and reportedly dying of illness, appeared like a specter in full armor despite being within the palace walls. Behind him came George Douglas, Andrew Kirk, and at least 6 other conspirators, their weapons drawn and their faces masked with the cold determination of men committed to violence. "Let it please your majesty that yonder man David come forth of your privy chamber, where he hath been overlong," Ruthven declared, his voice echoing strangely in the confined space. Mary, though terrified, showed the courage that royal blood was supposed to confer. "What offense hath he made?" she demanded, rising from her chair despite her pregnancy. The answer came not in words, but in action. Douglas lunged forward and grabbed Rizzio, who had thrown himself at Mary's feet begging for protection. The Italian secretary clung to Mary's gown, crying out in French for mercy, but the conspirators dragged him toward the door with savage determination. What happened next would haunt Mary for the rest of her life. As Rizzio was pulled from the chamber, Darnley, her husband, the father of her unborn child, held her back, preventing her from following or interfering. She watched helplessly as the man who had become perhaps her closest friend was dragged away to his death. The murder itself was conducted with medieval brutality. In the outer chamber, the conspirators fell upon Rizzio with daggers, striking him 56 times according to later accounts. They left Darnley's own dagger in the corpse, a deliberate gesture to implicate the king in the killing and bind him to their cause through shared guilt. When it was over, Rizzio's body lay in a pool of blood just steps from the queen's private chambers, his elegant clothes torn and soaked in gore. Mary, pale with shock and grief, was informed that her secretary was dead, and that she was now effectively a prisoner in her own palace. The psychological impact of this trauma cannot be overstated. Mary had been forced to watch her friend's brutal murder while her husband held her captive. She had seen the man she trusted torn from her protective embrace and butchered by nobles who claimed to serve her crown. Most devastating of all, she now understood that Darnley, the beautiful young man she had married for love and politics, was capable of the coldest betrayal. The Rizzio murder marked the point of no return in the royal marriage. Mary would never again trust Darnley completely, and he would never again possess even the illusion of her affection. The conspiracy had succeeded in eliminating their target, but it had also transformed a troubled marriage into something far more dangerous. A relationship built on mutual hatred, fear, and the certain knowledge that one partner was capable of orchestrating the other's destruction. The child Mary carried would be born into this atmosphere of violence and betrayal, and the wounds inflicted that March evening would fester until they demanded their own terrible resolution in the flames of Kirk O'Field. The aftermath of David Rizzio's murder revealed the true nature of 16th-century Scottish politics, a deadly game where loyalty could be bought, betrayal was currency, and survival demanded the cunning of a chess master. Mary Queen of Scots, traumatized by witnessing her friend's brutal death, was about to demonstrate that she possessed all three qualities in abundance. Within hours of Rizzio's murder, Edinburgh was in chaos. The Protestant conspirators had seized control of Holyrood Palace, posting guards at every entrance and effectively holding the pregnant queen prisoner. Their plan extended far beyond eliminating a single advisor. They intended to use Mary's captivity to force a complete restructuring of Scottish government, with themselves in positions of ultimate power and Darnley as their puppet king. But they had fatally underestimated both Mary's political intelligence and her capacity for cold-blooded revenge. Even as she grieved for Rizzio, the queen was already planning her counterattack with the calculating precision of a born strategist. Mary's first move was to exploit the weakest link in the conspiracy, her husband's guilty conscience and desperate need for her forgiveness. Darnley, despite his participation in the plot, was horrified by the actual violence he had witnessed. The sight of Rizzio's blood pooling on the palace floors and Mary's tears of rage and betrayal had shaken him more than he had anticipated. On the night following the murder, Mary summoned Darnley to her chambers. What transpired in that private meeting would never be fully recorded, but its results were immediate and devastating to the conspiracy. Mary, drawing upon every ounce of her royal charisma and feminine persuasion, convinced her husband that the Protestant lords were using him as a disposable tool, that once they had eliminated her Catholic advisors, they would turn on him as well. Her arguments were not mere manipulation. They contained uncomfortable truths that Darnley, in his guilt and fear, was finally ready to hear. The conspirators had indeed viewed him as a useful idiot, someone whose royal blood gave them legitimacy, but whose obvious weaknesses made him easy to control. They had no intention of granting him real power. He would remain a figurehead while they ruled Scotland in his name. By dawn on March 11th, just 2 days after Rizzio's murder, Darnley had secretly switched sides. In a move that would have been comic if the stakes weren't so deadly serious, the young king helped his wife escape from the very conspiracy he had helped orchestrate. The escape itself was worthy of an adventure novel. In the early hours of the morning, while the palace guards believed the royal couple was sleeping, Mary and Darnley slipped out through a network of secret passages that connected Holyrood to the nearby cemetery. Mary, 6 months pregnant and still weak from trauma, rode hard through the Scottish countryside to Dunbar Castle, where loyal Catholic lords were gathering an army for her rescue. The conspirators awoke to find their royal prisoners gone and their carefully laid plans in ruins. Without Mary and Darnley under their control, they lacked the legitimacy to claim they were acting in the crown's interest. Even worse, they now faced the prospect of a vengeful queen gathering forces against them. Mary's revenge, when it came, was swift and merciless. Within a week, she had assembled an army of nearly 8,000 men, a force that dwarfed anything the conspirators could muster. The speed with which Scottish nobles rallied to her cause demonstrated both her political skill and the fundamental miscalculation of her enemies. They had assumed that eliminating her foreign advisors would make her more popular. Instead, The brutal murder in her own chambers had generated sympathy and outrage. The Protestant conspirators, faced with overwhelming military odds, chose submission over a hopeless civil war. They threw themselves on Mary's mercy, begging forgiveness and claiming they had been misled by extremist influences. Some fled to England, where they would spend years in exile. Others, like the dying Patrick Ruthven, simply collapsed under the weight of their failure and guilt. But Mary's mercy came with conditions that revealed her transformation from naive romantic to hardened political operator. She pardoned most of the conspirators publicly, a gesture that demonstrated her royal magnanimity, while privately ensuring that their political power was permanently broken. Key participants were stripped of lands and titles, their families impoverished, their influence eliminated. Most significantly, she used the crisis to fundamentally restructure her government. The murder had shown her the dangers of relying too heavily on any single advisor or faction. Moving forward, she would balance Catholic and Protestant influences, foreign and domestic counselors, ensuring that no group could again threaten her with coordinated action. Darnley, meanwhile, found himself in an impossible position. His betrayal of the conspirators had saved his marriage and possibly his life, but it had also marked him as fundamentally untrustworthy. Mary had forgiven him publicly. She needed his cooperation to maintain the appearance of unity, but privately, she would never again confide in him or seek his counsel on matters of importance. The Rizzio murder had taught Mary a crucial lesson about the nature of power. In the brutal world of 16th century politics, survival required the ability to inspire both love and fear. Those who crossed her would face consequences, but those who served her loyally would be protected and rewarded. As spring turned to summer in 1566, Mary's position seemed stronger than ever. She had survived a coordinated attempt to destroy her government, demonstrated her political resilience, and eliminated her most dangerous enemies. On June 19th, she gave birth to a healthy son, James, the future king of both Scotland and England, though none could foresee that destiny. Yet beneath the surface celebrations and renewed stability, darker currents were already forming. Darnley's brief moment of redemption had passed, and his resentment over his powerless position was growing once again. More ominously, Mary had begun to notice the attentions of James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell, a powerful border lord whose loyalty during the Rizzio crisis had not gone unnoticed. The queen who had once believed in fairy tale romance was learning that in the Game of Thrones, every alliance came with a price. Every victory contained the seeds of future conflict, and even the most trusted advisors might one day hold a dagger behind their back. In the autumn of 1566, as Edinburgh's leaves turned the color of blood and gold, a new figure began to dominate the Scottish court, a man whose very presence seemed to alter the political atmosphere like the approach of a storm. James Hepburn, 4th Earl of Bothwell, was everything Lord Darnley was not. Physically powerful, politically ruthless, and possessed of the kind of masculine confidence that commanded respect rather than demanding it. Where Darnley was golden and beautiful, Bothwell was dark and dangerous. Standing nearly 6 feet tall with black hair, penetrating eyes, and the scarred hands of a warrior who had seen real combat, he embodied the brutal realities of Scottish border warfare. His family had served the Stuart dynasty for generations, earning their titles through blood and loyalty rather than hereditary privilege. Most importantly for Mary's future, Bothwell had proven his devotion during the Rizzio crisis. While other nobles wavered or plotted, he had immediately rallied to the Queen's cause, bringing his border fighters to Dunbar Castle and helping to assemble the army that crushed the Protestant conspiracy. In Mary's eyes, he had demonstrated the one quality that had become more precious than gold: absolute loyalty. The attraction between Mary and Bothwell was evident to anyone who watched them together. During court ceremonies, their conversations lasted longer than protocol demanded. When she spoke, he listened with an intensity that suggested their words carried meanings beyond the formal exchanges of monarch and subject. When he entered a room, her posture straightened and her voice took on a different quality, stronger, more confident, as if his presence reminded her of her own power. Bothwell's influence over Mary grew throughout the winter of 1566 to 67, and with it grew the resentment of other nobles who saw their own access to the Queen diminishing. Unlike the cultured Rizzio, who had charmed his way into Mary's confidence through shared artistic interests, Bothwell commanded attention through sheer force of personality and demonstrated competence in the deadly serious business of keeping Mary alive and on her throne. Darnley watched this developing relationship with the poisonous mixture of jealousy and helplessness that had become his defining characteristics. He could see his wife's growing reliance on Bothwell, could sense the electric tension that crackled between them during public appearances, but was powerless to prevent or compete with it. His own political rehabilitation after the Rizzio affair had been superficial at best. Mary needed him for dynastic legitimacy, but she no longer trusted his judgment or sought his counsel. The young king's response to his marginalization was predictably self-destructive. He began drinking more heavily, consorting with increasingly disreputable companions, and making public displays of his dissatisfaction that embarrassed the crown and undermined royal dignity. At court functions, he would arrive late and leave early, speak rudely to foreign ambassadors, and generally conduct himself with the petulant arrogance of a spoiled child rather than the gravitas expected of a king. More dangerously, Darnley began renewing his contacts with Mary's enemies, both within Scotland and abroad. English intelligence reports from this period suggest he was secretly communicating with Protestant exiles who had fled after the Rizzio conspiracy, promising them pardons and restoration if they would help him reassert his authority over his wife's government. Bothwell, with the instincts of a lifelong survivor of Scottish politics, was well aware of Darnley's machinations. His network of informants, built through years of border warfare and political maneuvering, kept him apprised of every secret meeting, every whispered conversation, every letter that passed between the king and potential conspirators. Unlike the naive Rizzio, who had fatally underestimated the danger posed by court intrigue, Bothwell understood that in the Game of Thrones, paranoia was not a weakness, but a survival skill. By early 1567, the triangle of Mary, Darnley, and Bothwell had created a situation that could not continue indefinitely. Mary was increasingly dependent on Bothwell for both political advice and personal fulfillment, finding in him the kind of strong partnership that her marriage had never provided. Darnley was growing more desperate and reckless in his attempts to regain power and relevance. Bothwell was consolidating his influence while carefully monitoring threats to both his position and his queen. The Scottish court, meanwhile, buzzed with speculation about the true nature of Mary and Bothwell's relationship. Some whispered about secret meetings and passionate letters. Others noted how Mary's manner had changed since Bothwell's rise to prominence. She seemed more decisive, more confident, less willing to compromise with those who questioned her authority. What everyone understood, though few dared say openly, was that Scotland now had two kings, Darnley, who wore the crown but wielded no real power, and Bothwell, who commanded the Queen's trust and therefore controlled access to royal authority. This arrangement might have continued indefinitely if not for one crucial factor. Darnley's increasing desperation was making him dangerous not just to Bothwell's position, but to Mary's life itself. Intelligence reports from early 1567 suggest that Darnley was contemplating actions that went far beyond political maneuvering. He spoke privately about kidnapping his infant son and heir, taking the child to England or France, where he could claim a regency in the boy's name. Even more ominously, he hinted at scenarios where Mary's accidental death might solve all his problems, leaving him as regent for young James and free to rule Scotland in his own right. Bothwell, learning of these conversations through his spy network, faced a choice that would determine not only his own fate, but the future of the Scottish monarchy. He could try to manage Darnley's growing instability through political pressure and surveillance, risking that the unstable king might eventually succeed in one of his desperate schemes. Or he could take more direct action to eliminate a threat that was becoming more dangerous with each passing day. The Earl of Bothwell was not a man known for hesitation or half measures. Having spent his life in a world where delayed action often meant death, he began to contemplate a solution that would permanently resolve the problem of Lord Darnley. The question was not whether action was necessary, but how it could be accomplished without destroying the queen he served and possibly loved. As winter deepened into 1567, Bothwell began to gather around him a group of men whose loyalty was absolute and whose discretion was guaranteed by their own involvement in previous acts that could never see the light of day. The conspiracy that would culminate in the explosion at Kirk O'Field was beginning to take shape, driven not by abstract political theory, but by the immediate practical necessity of protecting Mary from her own husband's increasingly desperate schemes. The conspiracy to murder Lord Darnley began in earnest during the bitter January days of 1567, when Edinburgh lay frozen under a blanket of snow and the Scottish court huddled around their fires, plotting in whispers that their breath made visible in the frigid air. What would unfold over the following weeks was not the impulsive act of desperate men, but a carefully orchestrated assassination that involved some of Scotland's most powerful nobles and required resources that could only come from the highest levels of government. James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell, understood that eliminating Darnley would require more than simple murder. It would demand a conspiracy sophisticated enough to remove suspicion from Mary while ensuring that the king's death could not be traced back to those who ordered it. The challenge was immense. How do you kill a king in such a way that his death appears accidental or, at minimum, removes all evidence pointing to the true perpetrators? Bothwell's solution was as audacious as it was complex. Rather than relying on a single assassin who might be captured and tortured into revealing his employers, he would orchestrate an explosion so massive and destructive that it would obliterate not only Darnley, but all physical evidence of the crime itself. The plan required extensive preparation, significant financial resources, and the cooperation of multiple conspirators whose silence could be guaranteed through their own complicity. The first requirement was obtaining the enormous quantity of gunpowder needed to level a substantial building. In 16th century Scotland, such materials were controlled by the crown and military authorities. Civilians could not simply purchase enough explosives to destroy a house without attracting official attention. This suggests that the conspiracy enjoyed support from within Mary's government itself, with officials either actively participating or deliberately overlooking suspicious activities. Historical records indicate that large quantities of gunpowder began disappearing from Edinburgh Castle's armory during January 1567. The thefts were systematic and professional, suggesting inside knowledge of storage locations and security procedures. More significantly, no investigation was launched into these disappearances, a fact that points to high-level complicity in covering up evidence of the conspiracy's preparations. The second challenge was selecting an appropriate location for the murder. Darnley could not simply be lured to a random building and blown up. The assassination needed to occur in circumstances that would not immediately suggest foul play. Bothwell's solution was brilliant in its psychological manipulation. They would use Darnley's own illness and Mary's apparent reconciliation with her husband to create a scenario where the king's presence at the murder site would seem natural and innocent. Darnley had been suffering from what contemporary sources describe as the pox, most likely syphilis, though some historians suggest smallpox or another serious disease. Whatever the exact nature of his illness, it provided the perfect cover for isolating him in a house away from the main royal residences. Mary could claim concern for his health and her own safety, while secretly arranging for his elimination. The house chosen for this deadly charade was located in Kirk O'Field, a quiet suburb just outside Edinburgh's walls. The building belonged to the church and was typically used to house clerics and visiting dignitaries. Its isolated location made it perfect for the conspirators' purposes, far enough from the city center to minimize collateral damage, but close enough that Mary could plausibly visit her convalescing husband without arousing suspicion. Throughout January, workmen appeared at the Kirk O'Field house, ostensibly preparing it for the king's convalescence. They installed new furnishings, reinforced certain walls, and made other modifications that neighbors assumed were intended for Darnley's comfort. In reality, these improvements included the creation of hiding spaces for the massive quantities of gunpowder that would soon turn the modest residence into a death trap. The conspiracy's membership extended far beyond Bothwell himself. Evidence suggests that at least 6 other major Scottish nobles were directly involved in planning Darnley's murder, including Archibald Douglas, James Balfour, and several members of the powerful Hepburn clan. Each brought specific skills and resources to the plot. Douglas provided knowledge of explosives from his military background. Balfour offered legal expertise to help cover up evidence, and the Hepburn relatives contributed manpower and absolute loyalty to their clan chief. More controversially, historical analysis suggests that Mary herself may have been aware of the general outlines of the conspiracy, if not its specific details. Her behavior during January and early February 1567 shows a pattern of actions that facilitated the plot while providing her with plausible deniability. She insisted on moving Darnley to Kirk O'Field despite his protests, made several highly public visits to demonstrate her concern for his welfare, and then conspicuously absented herself from the house on the night of the explosion. The final weeks before the murder saw a flurry of clandestine activity throughout Edinburgh. Strange men were observed carrying heavy parcels toward Kirk O'Field under cover of darkness. Local residents reported unusual sounds from the house, hammering, scraping, and other construction noises that continued well into the night. Most ominously, several people noticed the smell of sulfur and saltpeter in the air around the building, the unmistakable odor of large quantities of gunpowder. By early February, everything was in place. The house had been transformed into a massive bomb, with enough explosive material secreted in its walls and basement to obliterate the entire structure. Darnley, still recovering from his illness and unaware of the deadly trap surrounding him, had been convinced to remain at Kirk O'Field for his health and safety. Mary had established a pattern of regular visits that would provide her with an alibi while ensuring she was nowhere near the building when the explosion occurred. The psychological pressure on the conspirators during these final days must have been enormous. They were preparing to commit regicide, the murder of a king, one of the most serious crimes imaginable in the 16th century world. Detection would mean not just death, but the kind of prolonged, agonizing execution reserved for those who attacked the divine right of monarchy itself. Yet they pressed forward, driven by their conviction that Darnley's continued existence posed an even greater threat to Mary's rule and their own survival. The irony of their situation was perfect and terrible. In order to protect their queen from her husband's increasingly desperate schemes, they would have to commit an act so heinous that its discovery would destroy her more completely than anything Darnley himself might have planned. They were walking a tightrope over an abyss, and the slightest misstep would send them all tumbling into destruction. As February 9th dawned cold and clear over Edinburgh, the conspirators made their final preparations. Within 24 hours, the most spectacular murder in Scottish history would transform the political landscape of Britain and set in motion events that would ultimately cost Mary her throne and her life. The fuse had been lit, metaphorically speaking. Now all that remained was to ensure that Lord Darnley was in the right place when their carefully laid plans exploded into deadly reality. February 9th, 1567, began as an ordinary winter day in Edinburgh, with frost glistening on the cobblestones and smoke rising from countless chimneys into the pale Scottish sky. For Lord Darnley, confined to the modest house at Kirk O'Field for what he believed was his continued recovery, it would be his last dawn. The elaborate machinery of assassination that had been months in the making was about to spring into deadly motion. Mary Queen of Scots arrived at Kirk O'Field in the early afternoon, accompanied by a small retinue of courtiers and servants. To outside observers, this was simply another visit by a devoted wife to her convalescing husband. Mary wore black velvet trimmed with fur, appropriate for both the cold weather and the mourning she would soon have cause to display. She brought musicians, sweetmeats, and other diversions intended to lift Darnley's spirits and demonstrate her renewed affection. The performance was flawless. Mary spent several hours at Darnley's bedside, chatting about court gossip, discussing plans for their return to normal married life, and even sharing intimate moments that suggested their troubled relationship was healing. Servants later testified that the royal couple seemed genuinely affectionate, with Mary feeding Darnley delicacies by hand and laughing at his attempts at wit. But beneath this domestic tranquility, darker currents were flowing. Mary's visit served multiple purposes beyond providing an alibi. It allowed the conspirators to make final preparations while ensuring that potential witnesses saw nothing unusual in the house's activity. More importantly, it established the precise timing that would be crucial to the plot's success. As evening approached, Mary announced that she needed to return to Holyrood Palace for a wedding celebration being held for one of her servants. The timing was not coincidental. The festivities would provide dozens of witnesses to her presence elsewhere when the explosion occurred. Darnley, still weak from his illness, expressed regret at her departure but made no move to accompany her. He would spend the night at Kirk Field, he said, and perhaps feel strong enough to return to the palace in the morning. Mary's farewell to her husband was observed by several people, and their accounts would later prove crucial to the investigation. She kissed Darnley tenderly, promised to return soon, and even paused at the door to blow him another kiss. To those watching, it seemed like the reconciliation of a couple who had weathered serious marital storms and emerged stronger. What none of the casual observers could know was that Mary had just said goodbye to Darnley for the last time. The royal party departed Kirk Field at approximately 8 o'clock in the evening, riding through the darkening streets toward Holyrood Palace where the wedding celebration was already underway. Mary's attendance at the festivities was conspicuous and well documented. She danced, laughed with her courtiers, and showed every sign of enjoying herself. No one could later claim that she had slipped away or behaved in any manner suggesting guilty knowledge of what was about to unfold. Meanwhile, back at Kirk Field, Darnley settled in for what he assumed would be a quiet evening of recovery. His servants helped him prepare for bed, banking the fires and arranging his medicines within easy reach. The house felt secure and comfortable, a refuge from the political storms that had battered his marriage and his pride. He had no reason to suspect that the walls around him concealed enough gunpowder to obliterate a small castle. At approximately 10 o'clock, most of Darnley's household retired for the night. Only his personal valet, William Taylor, remained in the house, sleeping in an adjacent chamber. This isolation was exactly what the conspirators had planned. Minimal casualties among innocent servants, maximum impact on their primary target. In the hours after midnight, shadowy figures began moving through the streets around Kirk Field. These were Bothwell's men, making their final preparations for the explosion that would end Darnley's life, and, they hoped, solve Mary's political problems permanently. They moved with the practiced stealth of soldiers conducting a night raid, their footsteps muffled by the snow and their faces obscured by darkness. The exact sequence of events between midnight and 2 in the morning remains one of history's most debated mysteries. What is certain is that something went wrong with the original plan. The massive explosion that finally destroyed the house was supposed to kill Darnley instantly, obliterating all evidence of murder in a blast that would appear accidental. Instead, both Darnley and his servant somehow escaped the building before the gunpowder detonated, only to meet their deaths in the small orchard behind the house. The most likely explanation, supported by forensic analysis of contemporary accounts, is that Darnley was awakened by suspicious sounds, perhaps the conspirators making final preparations, or the smell of slow-burning fuses that preceded the main explosion. Realizing that something was terribly wrong, he roused William Taylor and attempted to flee through a window or back door. But the conspirators had anticipated this possibility. As Darnley and his servant stumbled into the garden in their nightshirts, they found armed men waiting for them. The strangling that followed was swift and efficient, professional killers ensuring that their mission would not fail because of an unexpected escape. The explosion that followed at 2 o'clock in the morning was catastrophic beyond anything Edinburgh had ever experienced. The blast was heard 10 miles away, and the destruction was so complete that virtually nothing remained of the house except scattered rubble and a crater where the foundation had been. Windows shattered throughout the surrounding neighborhood, and the flash of light illuminated the city like artificial daylight. When searchers arrived at dawn, they found exactly what the conspirators had intended them to find: apparent evidence that the King of Scotland had died in a terrible accident. The explosion seemed to explain everything: a house destroyed, a king dead, a tragedy that would shock Europe but implicate no one in particular. Except for one crucial detail that would unravel the entire conspiracy: the bodies in the garden. Darnley and Taylor, lying 60 yards from the explosion site without a burn mark between them, their necks bearing the unmistakable signs of strangulation, represented a forensic puzzle that no amount of political manipulation could explain away. How had they escaped a blast powerful enough to level their lodging, only to die of entirely different causes in a location where no debris had fallen? The physical evidence told a story that contradicted the official narrative of accidental death. The rope found near the bodies, the suspicious positioning of personal effects, and most damning of all, the complete absence of blast trauma on the corpses, all pointed toward a conclusion that would terrify the Scottish establishment. Their king had been murdered, and his killers possessed resources and planning capabilities that suggested involvement by the highest levels of government. As the sun rose over Edinburgh on February 10, 1567, the golden-haired young man who had once been Scotland's most eligible bachelor lay dead in a frozen garden. His dreams of power and his troubled marriage both ended by the brutal logic of 16th-century politics. The explosion that was meant to hide his murder had instead created the very evidence that would expose it, setting in motion a chain of events that would destroy not just his killers, but the queen they had tried to protect. The news reached Mary Queen of Scots at 6 o'clock on the morning of February 10th, delivered by a breathless messenger who had ridden hard from Kirk O'Field through the grey Edinburgh dawn. The queen was in her private chambers at Holyrood Palace, still in her nightgown, when the man knelt before her and spoke the words that would shatter her world. "Your Majesty, the king is dead." Mary's immediate reaction, witnessed by her ladies-in-waiting, was one of apparent shock and grief. She cried out, staggered backward, and had to be supported by her attendants as the full implications of the news sank in. Whether this response was genuine emotion or masterful performance would become one of the most debated questions in the investigation that followed, but to those present, the Queen's distress seemed utterly authentic. Within hours, Mary had donned the black mourning dress that would become her standard attire for the coming months and traveled to Kirk O'Field to see the devastation for herself. What she found there must have been deeply unsettling, regardless of her prior knowledge of the conspiracy. The house where she had kissed her husband goodbye the previous evening was nothing more than scattered rubble and charred timber. The explosion had been so complete that even experienced soldiers struggled to comprehend the amount of gunpowder required to cause such destruction. But it was the discovery of Darnley's body that presented Mary with her first impossible choice. Standing in that frozen orchard, looking down at her husband's unmarked corpse 60 yards from the blast site, she faced a decision that would determine not just her immediate survival, but the fate of the Scottish crown itself. Mary was not naive about political intrigue. The Rizzio murder had taught her brutal lessons about court conspiracy and the lengths to which desperate men would go to achieve their goals. Looking at Darnley's body, she would have immediately understood that this was no accidental death. The evidence of strangulation, the suspicious positioning of the corpse, the sheer impossibility of escaping such an explosion only to die of entirely different causes. All of it pointed toward a coordinated assassination. More importantly, Mary almost certainly knew who was responsible. Bothwell's increased influence over her government, his access to military resources, and his obvious animosity toward Darnley made him the most likely architect of the conspiracy. Whether Mary had explicitly authorized the murder or simply created conditions where Bothwell felt empowered to act on her behalf, she now faced the consequences of her husband's elimination. Her first choice was whether to order a genuine investigation that might expose the truth, or to participate in a cover-up that would protect the conspirators and herself. A real investigation would inevitably lead to Bothwell and his associates, potentially revealing Mary's own complicity in the plot. But a sham investigation would leave her vulnerable to future blackmail and ensure that rumors about her involvement in regicide would follow her for the rest of her reign. Mary chose the cover-up, though she disguised it as a pursuit of justice. She announced a reward of £2,000 for information leading to the arrest of her husband's killers, an enormous sum that demonstrated the seriousness of her commitment to finding the truth. She ordered her magistrates to interview witnesses, collect evidence, and spare no effort in bringing the murderers to justice. But behind these public gestures, Mary worked systematically to protect those responsible for Darnley's death. Key witnesses were discouraged from testifying or found their memories mysteriously unclear about crucial details. Physical evidence disappeared from official custody or was ruled irrelevant to the investigation. Most tellingly, despite the obvious sophistication of the plot and the massive resources required to execute it, the official investigation focused primarily on minor figures and foreign agents rather than powerful Scottish nobles. Mary's second impossible choice concerned her relationship with Bothwell himself. The Earl's role in Darnley's murder made him simultaneously the most dangerous man in Scotland and the only person whose loyalty she could absolutely trust. He had risked everything to eliminate the threat her husband posed, binding himself to her through shared guilt and mutual dependence. But he had also made himself politically radioactive. Association with him would inevitably generate suspicion about her own involvement in the conspiracy. Logic dictated that Mary should distance herself from Bothwell, perhaps even sacrifice him to deflect suspicion from herself. A wise monarch would have allowed the investigation to discover his guilt, expressed appropriate shock and outrage, and then executed him as a regicidal traitor. This would have satisfied public demands for justice while protecting her own reputation. Instead, Mary chose to draw closer to Bothwell, elevating his position at court and relying on him even more heavily for political advice and personal protection. Within weeks of Darnley's murder, Bothwell had become the most powerful man in Scotland, controlling access to the Queen and wielding authority that approached royal prerogatives. This decision was politically disastrous, but psychologically understandable. Mary had learned through bitter experience that loyalty was the rarest and most precious quality in the brutal world of 16th century politics. Bothwell had proven his devotion in the most absolute way possible by committing murder on her behalf. In a court full of ambitious nobles who might betray her for personal advantage, he was the one man whose interests were permanently aligned with her own. Mary's third impossible choice involved her public response to the growing rumors about her involvement in Darnley's death. European courts buzzed with speculation about the convenient timing of the explosion, the Queen's suspicious behavior in the days leading up to the murder, and her obvious reliance on the man most likely responsible for orchestrating it. She could have addressed these rumors directly, submitting herself to formal questioning or inviting foreign investigators to examine the evidence. Such transparency might have damaged her immediate political position, but it could have preserved her long-term legitimacy by demonstrating her commitment to justice and truth. Instead, Mary chose defiance. She dismissed the rumors as the malicious gossip of her enemies, refused to submit to questioning about her activities, and used her royal authority to suppress discussion of the case. When critics suggested that her relationship with Bothwell was inappropriate for a woman so recently widowed, she responded with increasing anger and imperious assertions of her divine right to choose her own counselors. This strategy might have succeeded if Mary had possessed the political strength to silence her critics permanently. But the Darnley murder had weakened her position in ways she did not fully comprehend. Scottish nobles who had previously supported her began to distance themselves, unwilling to be associated with a queen suspected of regicide. Foreign allies grew cautious about their commitments to a monarch whose legitimacy was increasingly questioned. Most dangerously, Mary's choices had created a situation where her political survival depended entirely on Bothwell's continued protection. She had bound herself to him so completely that his destruction would inevitably mean her own. When enemies finally moved against the Earl, they would simultaneously be moving against the Queen, a realization that would soon transform Scottish politics into open civil war. By April 1567, just 2 months after Darnley's death, Mary found herself trapped in a web of consequences flowing from the impossible choices she had made. She had chosen loyalty over wisdom, defiance over transparency, and personal feelings over political calculation. Each decision had seemed logical in isolation, but together they had created a situation where her enemies needed only to prove Bothwell's guilt to destroy her completely. The Queen, who had once been praised throughout Europe for her beauty, intelligence, and political skill, was about to discover that in the Game of Thrones, even the most impossible choices have consequences that no amount of royal authority can escape. The sham trial of James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell, for the murder of Lord Darnley began on April 12, 1567, in Edinburgh's Tolbooth, a proceeding so transparently fraudulent that it would destroy whatever remained of Mary's political credibility and unite her enemies in open rebellion. What unfolded in that crowded courtroom was not a search for truth, but an elaborate performance designed to provide legal cover for the most obvious conspiracy in Scottish history. The very circumstances of the trial revealed its predetermined outcome. Bothwell himself had arranged the proceedings, selecting the judges, controlling the witness list, and ensuring that his own supporters dominated the courtroom. No prosecutor appeared to present evidence against him. Instead, the Earl faced only token accusations that were immediately refuted by carefully coached witnesses who testified to his noble character and complete innocence. Most damning of all, the trial lasted only 7 hours from start to finish. 7 hours to examine one of the most complex murder cases in Scottish history, involving massive explosives, multiple crime scenes, and evidence of an elaborate conspiracy. The speed of the proceedings made clear that the outcome had been decided long before the first witness took the stand. Bothwell's acquittal was announced with theatrical flourish, and he immediately issued a public challenge. Any man who dared accuse him of Lord Darnley's murder could face him in single combat to prove their claims through trial by battle. This medieval gesture was calculated to silence critics through intimidation. Few Scottish nobles were willing to risk their lives fighting one of the country's most skilled warriors over what had already been legally resolved in Bothwell's favor. But the political establishment was not fooled by these legal machinations. John Knox, Scotland's most influential Protestant reformer, denounced the trial from his pulpit at St. Giles Cathedral, declaring that justice was not done and warning that God's wrath would fall upon a nation that allowed regicide to go unpunished. His words echoed through Edinburgh's churches and meeting halls, giving religious authority to the growing conviction that Mary and Bothwell had conspired to murder the king. Foreign reactions were even more damaging to Mary's cause. Elizabeth Tudor's government in England began treating Mary as a suspected murderess rather than a fellow monarch, cutting off diplomatic communications and offering asylum to Scottish nobles who fled their queen's increasingly authoritarian rule. The French court, where Mary had been raised and which had previously supported her claims to the English succession, grew cold and distant, unwilling to associate with a ruler whose legitimacy was so seriously compromised. Mary's response to this mounting criticism revealed how completely she had committed herself to Bothwell's protection. Rather than attempting to rebuild her damaged reputation through moderate policies and inclusive governance, she moved even more decisively to consolidate power around her controversial protector. On May 3, just 3 weeks after his acquittal, she elevated Bothwell to Duke of Orkney, one of Scotland's highest titles, traditionally reserved for members of the royal family. This promotion was political suicide disguised as a reward for faithful service. By making Bothwell a duke, Mary was effectively announcing to the world that the man suspected of murdering her husband now enjoyed her complete confidence and favor. The message could not have been clearer if she had proclaimed her own guilt from Edinburgh Castle's ramparts. The final act of this political tragedy unfolded with stunning speed. On April 24, while traveling from Edinburgh to Stirling Castle to visit her infant son, Mary was intercepted by Bothwell and a force of 800 armed men. What happened next remains controversial. Mary claimed she was kidnapped and forced against her will to accompany Bothwell to Dunbar Castle, while Bothwell's supporters insisted she went willingly as part of a prearranged plan. The truth probably lies somewhere between these extremes. Mary may have consented to a staged abduction that would provide her with political cover for actions she wanted to take, but could not justify openly. The kidnapping allowed her to spend time alone with Bothwell, while maintaining the fiction that she was acting under duress rather than by choice. What is certain is that Mary remained at Dunbar Castle for 10 days, during which time she either was raped by Bothwell or entered into a sexual relationship with him voluntarily. When she emerged from this isolation on May 6th, she was no longer simply suspected of complicity in her husband's murder. She was now seen as the willing partner of his killer. On May 15th, 1567, exactly 3 months after Darnley's murder, Mary Queen of Scots married James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell, in a hastily arranged Protestant ceremony at Holyrood Palace. The wedding was attended by only a handful of supporters, and the bride wore black rather than traditional white, appropriate both for her recent widowhood and the funeral of her political career. The marriage to Bothwell represented Mary's final impossible choice. She could have preserved her throne by sacrificing the man who had killed for her, but she chose instead to bind her fate to his through marriage vows that made their partnership legally unbreakable. In doing so, she transformed herself from a queen who might have survived scandal into a monarch who had openly embraced regicide. The Scottish nobility's response was swift and unforgiving. Within days of the wedding, a confederation of lords had formed under the banner of protecting young Prince James from his mother's evil counselors. Led by figures like the Earl of Morton and Lord Lindsay, this group commanded significant military resources and enjoyed the tacit support of both England and the Scottish Protestant Church. Their manifesto, circulated throughout Scotland and Europe, made no mention of deposing Mary directly. Such an action would have been too radical for 16th-century sensibilities. Instead, they claimed to be acting as loyal subjects seeking to rescue their queen from the malign influence of Bothwell and restore proper governance to Scotland. The civil war that erupted in June 1567 was brief but decisive. At the Battle of Carberry Hill on June 15th, Mary and Bothwell's forces faced the Confederate lords in what would be the final confrontation of their reign. The outcome was determined not by military prowess, but by political isolation. Most of Mary's traditional supporters had abandoned her, unwilling to fight for a queen they believed had murdered her husband and debased her crown through marriage to his killer. Faced with inevitable defeat, Bothwell fled into exile, while Mary surrendered to the Confederate lords on promises that she would be treated with the respect due to her royal status. These promises proved worthless. Within hours of her surrender, the woman who had once been Europe's most powerful female monarch found herself a prisoner, her reign effectively ended by the choices she had made in the aftermath of her husband's murder. The tragedy of Mary Queen of Scots was not that she was innocent of Darnley's death. The evidence suggests she was at minimum complicit in the conspiracy that eliminated him. The tragedy was that her impossible choices in the wake of the murder transformed a potentially survivable scandal into the complete destruction of her political authority. She had chosen loyalty over prudence, love over politics, and defiance over diplomacy. Each decision had seemed reasonable given her limited options, but together they had created a cascade of consequences that no amount of royal authority could control. The beautiful queen who had once captivated courts from Edinburgh to Paris was about to discover that even monarchs must answer for their choices when those choices include regicide. On July 24, 1567, in the bleak fortress of Lochleven Castle surrounded by the dark waters of a Scottish loch, Mary Queen of Scots signed the most devastating document of her life, an act of abdication that transferred the crown she had worn for 24 years to her 13-month-old son, James VI. The elegant hand that had once signed treaties with European powers now trembled as it signed away everything she had fought to preserve. The woman who put the pen to parchment that summer day was no longer the confident queen who had married Lord Darnley 2 years earlier. Months of imprisonment, political humiliation, and psychological torture had transformed the once radiant monarch into a hollow-eyed shadow of her former self. Yet, even in defeat, Mary possessed enough political intelligence to understand the full implications of what she was signing, not just her own destruction, but the beginning of a new chapter in British history that would echo through the centuries. The murder of Lord Darnley had set in motion forces that no one, not even its architects, had fully anticipated. The explosion at Kirk had been intended to solve Mary's immediate political problems by eliminating a dangerous and unstable husband. Instead, it had created far greater difficulties that would ultimately cost her everything she valued. The conspiracy's fundamental miscalculation lay in its assumption that killing Darnley would strengthen Mary's position by removing a source of domestic instability. The conspirators believed that with the troublesome king dead and his murder disguised as an accident, Mary would be free to rule Scotland with greater authority and choose her own path in the complex world of international politics. But they had failed to account for the forensic evidence that would expose their plot, the political consequences of Mary's obvious protection of the primary suspect, and the profound psychological impact that knowledge of her complicity would have on both her subjects and foreign allies. The murder that was meant to enhance her power had instead destroyed the moral authority upon which her reign depended. James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell, paid the ultimate price for his loyalty to Mary. After fleeing Scotland following their defeat at Carberry Hill, he spent years as a hunted exile, pursued by bounty hunters and living in constant fear of assassination. His eventual capture by Danish forces in 1567 led to imprisonment in the notorious Dragsholm Castle, where he would spend the final 11 years of his life chained to a pillar in a dungeon cell barely large enough for a man to lie down. The psychological torture of his confinement was deliberate and complete. Bothwell, who had once commanded armies and influenced the fate of nations, was reduced to a gibbering madman who spent his days pulling out his own hair and speaking to imaginary companions. When he died in 1578, his body was so twisted by years of confinement that it resembled more a grotesque sculpture than the remains of what had once been Scotland's most powerful nobleman. Mary's own fate, while less immediately brutal, was perhaps even more tragic. Her escape from Lechleven Castle in 1568 and subsequent flight to England represented the final destruction of her political relevance. Elizabeth Tudor, despite their family relationship, could not risk harboring a Catholic queen with claims to the English throne, especially one suspected of murdering her husband. Mary would spend the next 19 years as a prisoner in various English castles, her life gradually consumed by increasingly desperate plots against Elizabeth's government. The execution of Mary Queen of Scots on February 8, 1587, represented the final consequence of the choices made during those fateful months in 1567. The woman who had once been Europe's most eligible monarch died on a scaffold at Fotheringay Castle, her head severed by an executioner's axe wielded in the name of Protestant England. Her last words were prayers in Latin, the language of the Catholic faith that had shaped so many of the decisions leading to her destruction. But perhaps the most profound legacy of Lord Darnley's murder was its impact on the child who survived the political catastrophe, James VI of Scotland, who would become James I of England and unite the two kingdoms that had fought for centuries. The infant who slept peacefully in Stirling Castle while his father was murdered and his mother destroyed would grow up to become one of Britain's most successful monarchs, ruling both realms with the kind of stable authority that had eluded his parents' generation. James's success was built upon the harsh lessons learned from his parents' failures. He understood that royal marriage was too important to be driven by passion, that political alliances required careful balance rather than total commitment to any single faction, and that the appearance of moral authority was as crucial to effective rule as actual political power. The murder of Lord Darnley had taught subsequent generations of British monarchs that the divine right of kings was not absolute, that even royal blood offered no protection against the consequences of political miscalculation and moral compromise. The explosion at Kirk O'Field had destroyed more than a house and a king. It had shattered the medieval notion that monarchs could act with impunity as long as they maintained the support of their immediate circle. In the broader sweep of British history, Darnley's assassination marked the beginning of the end for the kind of personal monarchy that had characterized medieval rule. The scandal surrounding his death contributed to growing demands for constitutional limits on royal authority, parliamentary oversight of government policy, and legal accountability that would apply even to those who claimed to rule by divine appointment. The cherry orchard where Lord Darnley died in his nightshirt on that February morning has long since disappeared, replaced by Edinburgh's urban expansion and the relentless march of progress. But the questions raised by his murder continue to resonate through British constitutional history. How much power should any individual wield over the lives and deaths of others? What happens when personal loyalty conflicts with public justice? And can any political system survive when its leaders place private interests above the common good? The answers to these questions would ultimately transform Britain from a collection of feudal kingdoms into a constitutional monarchy, where even kings and queens must answer to the law. The blood spilled at Kirk O'Field had watered the seeds of modern democratic governance, though none of the participants in that deadly conspiracy could have foreseen such consequences. What's your take on this case? Share your thoughts below and subscribe to the Crime O'Clock, because the next mystery is already ticking.